It's good to have y'all with us this morning. We appreciate everyone and your attendance, your being here. I hope this is being a benefit to you. This is February the 5th, 2005, and we are studying the general epistles, and we are in James, the 3rd chapter this morning, and want to cover that entire chapter and hopefully get into the 4th chapter. And as y'all probably know by now, it's difficult for me to keep on that type of a schedule. In last week, as we ended our study, we were looking at verse 1 of chapter 3, how that we are not to be many teachers because there is a severe judgment that we are going to be judged by, as we are dealing not only then with our souls, but we are also dealing with the souls of those who hear us. And thus he sets forth the idea, do not be many teachers or many masters, King James, knowing we shall receive the greater condemnation. Now then, in verse 2, he actually enters into a study of the tongue. He says, therefore, in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same is a perfect man, and able to also to bridle the whole body. The word offend is a Greek word, pataio, and it means to stumble or fall, and it's in the present tense. Thus, it indicates someone who continues to stumble, keeps on falling. These present tenses are used, for example, in 1 John 1, verses 7 through 9. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with Christ. That's continuing to walk in the light. We continue to have fellowship. The blood of Christ continues to cleanse us from our sins, and so forth. There is that aspect of a continuation, and that's present tense. And literally here is, we all offend. This, for one thing, shows the universality of sin. All men commit sin. Emphasized many times within the Scriptures, for example, Romans 3 and verse 23, Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 20, 1 Kings 8 and verse 46, 1 John 1 verse 8, verse 10. Probably should have included Galatians 3 and verse 22 in that list as well. And so man's lot is that of sin. We all commit sin. We not only offend God, but we offend people. Sometimes we express things improperly, and we offend them. The wise man in Proverbs, the 10th chapter and verse 19, makes the statement that in the multitude of words there wanteth not sin, but he that refraineth his lips is wise. And so here's the multitude of words we're going to offend people. It's just the nature of our speech and the way in which we talk. We're going to offend others by our speech, whether it's the way we express things or what we say. At times we're going to do that. It's interesting that James here includes himself. We all offend. And thus, he is either including himself in that, or he's using it from a statement in relationship to a kingly we, as it's sometimes called in the English. That is, just using it from a general standpoint. But if he is including himself in this, we offend all, and dealing with our speech in particular, he would be separating that inspired writing from other speech that he is giving, and inspired speech would not be included in that. In Galatians, the 2nd chapter, and specifically verse 11, but in that context we have Peter committing sin. But that committing of sin does not in any way affect his writing by inspiration or his speaking by inspiration. And thus the same thing would be said of James here. Even though he might offend in speech, yet when he is writing by inspiration or when he is speaking by inspiration, there's not going to be any problem with that. It is going to be accurate without mistakes, and in that it would not be offensive from that standpoint. Although we could discuss the aspect in regards to that many times the truth is offensive to people because people do not want to live according to that truth, and thus it is exposing their error and their sins within their life, and they don't like that, and thus they are offended from that aspect. Offending not in word, though, is not limited here, or not limited to teachers. Now, that's the context of the statement that's here, but it literally applies to all Christians. And he makes the statement, the same is a perfect man. The word perfect is from that Greek word teleos, and it means something that is complete. When it's dealing with things, it's dealing with that aspect of complete. When it's dealing with man, as it is here, it's dealing with one who has reached their full maturity, or they are spiritually reached a full spiritual growth. Two of the most difficult things for man to control would be, first, his thoughts, and second, his tongue or his words. And if you go to the Scriptures, there's a great deal of emphasis placed in the Scriptures about controlling our thought. A lot of people seem to think and get the idea that it's all right if improper thoughts are in our minds as long as we don't express those things. Well, that's not the case. We have to learn to control our thinking. A few of the passages, Proverbs 23 and verse 7, as man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Matthew 15, verse 10 and 11, and then verse 16 through 19. Jesus teaches that a man is going to do those things that are from the heart. And Philippians 4th chapter and verse 8, Paul encourages us to think on certain things. That would also include us not thinking on other things. But then we also see an emphasis placed upon the tongue. Here we see that. Obviously it is being discussed here. But also Matthew the 12th chapter, verse 36 and 37. By your words you're going to be justified. By your words you're going to be condemned. Ephesians the 4th chapter, verse 28 and verse 31. We're not to lie. We're not to allow corrupt communication to proceed out of our mouth. And so there's likewise the emphasis on the tongue as well as the mind. There needs to be an emphasis on both of these things, and yet it is one of the hardest things for man to do. Control your thoughts, control your tongues. But when you're able to control your tongue, James is saying that's when you're starting to reach, or that's when you're reaching that spiritual maturity. The same is a perfect man. And he's able to bridle the whole body as well. The word bridle is from a Greek word, and I'll probably mispronounce this, but kilinegogeo. And it deals with to lead or to guide with a bit. But the aspect of it is thus to check or restrain. If we control the tongue, if we check it, we restrain the tongue, then we are mature, and we are showing then that we have control of our entire body. Once you can control the tongue, it shows that you have the power and the ability to control other aspects of your life as well, and thus your entire body. Verse 3, he goes on, "Behold, we put bits in the horse's mouth, that they may obey us, and turn about their whole body." This is the first of actually several illustrations that James is going to use to show the influence or the power of the tongue. And that was what we start with in verse 2. But now then, he's going to illustrate the point. Each of these comparisons are strong forces within their own element. So is the tongue. Here you have a horse. A horse with all of its strength and power. A horse is a little bigger than we are. It's stronger than we are. Yet we put a bit in their mouth, and we can control the horse. We can lead it to the right, to the left. We can make it go. We can get it to stop. You control the horse by a very small bit. Well, if you can control the tongue, the application is you'll be able to control the body as well. Thus, the body is controlled by the tongue, is what he's saying here. Verse 4, "Behold, we also the ships, which, though they be so great and are driven of fierce winds, yet are they turned about with a very small helm, whithersoever the governor listeth." A large ship, or a ship, is very large objects. If you've been around some of these large ships, you're just amazed at the size of them. And if you look at them, they would seem unmanageable because of how big they are. And then you also have the seas operating on them. Of course, there's the paths of the sea, as we see in the 8th Psalm, and as Matthew Fontaine Maury found out, as he became the one who discovered those paths in the sea because of the 8th Psalm. So those paths in the sea are operating on them. You have the winds that are operating upon them. You have all of these things operating on this huge ship, and yet you have a real small rudder, small object which controls the ship. And the governor is what we would call the steersman or the helmsman. The word listeth comes from the Greek word bolumai, and it means to will deliberately, to have a purpose. And so here's this helmsman, this governor, who has a certain purpose, and he stands on the top of the ship, or at the top of the ship, and he steers this great ship with a real small rudder wherever he wants it to go. Even though might go against the wind, it can go against the wind. Even though the wind might be blowing it one way, it can go the other way. Even though the paths of the sea are taking it one way, it can go the other way. Wherever the steersman or the helmsman decides to take it. The meaning of the illustration now, these two illustrations, is that we are able to control large animals, large ships, with very small objects. How much more ought we to be able to govern ourselves, and if we rule over our tongue in particular, then we will control the whole being as well. And you might also notice in these first two illustrations that there is a good that is accomplished by these aspects. Putting a bit in the horse's mouth to control the body, the very small rudder controlling the ship, good is accomplished by both of those. The tongue, when used properly, can produce good. And so we see that aspect as well. Verse 5, he says, "Even so, the tongue is a little member, and boasteth great things. Behold, how great a matter a little fire kindleth." Here's the application now of these illustrations of the rudder and the bridle. The tongue is a small member in comparison to the body. It's full of power and influence. The tongue is relatively a weak part of the body from a physical standpoint. You can't do a great deal with your tongue. It doesn't have real strong physical muscles. It's not going to be able to lift a great weight or anything like that, but it's very strong in other ways. We have, through the years, drawn some illustrations and analogies in relationship to the tongue that I think are appropriate here. The tongue is enclosed in the mouth, encased by teeth, shut off or behind two lips, hemmed in, protected, held in every way imaginable. Yet out it comes. That's the way the tongue is. Another is that we have, and this was expressed in James 1 and verse 19, we have one tongue, but 2 ears and 2 eyes. Notice that the eyes and the ears are open, but the tongue is shut up tight. And that's maybe some lessons that we need to be drawing from that aspect as to the use of the tongue. The word boasteth is from actually 2 Greek words taken into or made into one. Megaloukio, and it means great things, and to lift up the neck, thus to boast. You can see someone who's starting to get proud, and they kind of stretch their necks up. That's the idea of this word, boasteth. He's stretching, he's getting that proud look. His nose is going up in the air because he's stretching out the neck, lifting up the neck. Great things as far as well, that's the tongue. Tongue lifts up the neck. It boasts great things. Now then, we get to a third illustration in this verse, though. The other 2 illustrations that we've seen so far is there is a controlled effect. Here, though, there's a destructive and an uncontrolled effect. A small fire can ignite a large quantity of items. The word matter is from the Greek word hule, and how great a fire, or how great a matter a little fire kindleth. The word hule, matter, there literally means wood or forest. So how great a wood or great a forest a little fire can make. Several years ago, I worked on a volunteer fire department, and it became amazing, and we all know the principle of a little bitty fire, yet sometimes the damage that is done in that is acres and even miles of destruction. A small spark, a flame, a fire. If that small spark is properly prepared, can set an entire forest on fire. That's the way the tongue is. All it takes is a little bitty word placed in the proper place, and that little bitty word can destroy people, it can destroy families, and it can destroy congregations. How great a matter a little fire kindleth. That improperly placed word, or in that sense, a properly placed word to destroy all of these things. It is improper to do such, but that proper word said in the right time, the right places, to the right individuals, can do such great destruction. And so, verse 6, the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, and it defileth the whole body, and setteth on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire of hell. The tongue is a fire in at least 3 ways that are set forth here. First way, in the pain that it inflicts. the tongue, pain, or a fire and a burn, if you get burned, there is a great deal of pain in that. The pain that burn inflicts is some of the greatest pain that's known to man. Well, the tongue can be like that. Second, the destruction which attends it. The destruction of a fire is just amazing to see. And third, the effects which follow it. The effects of that fire. After you see that fire, it's just amazing to see it. The effects of it, the destruction that has come as a result of it, not only the destruction of the fire itself, but what it's left in its wake, the effects that follow it. The tongue is like this in all those ways. It can afflict so much pain. It can destroy things, and the effects will be destruction for years and years to follow. And sometimes those effects will never be overcome. And so the tongue is the epitome of the world and all that is in the world. It's represented by the tongue, or in the tongue, on a small scale. And so we see here now the tongue, the improper use of the tongue pollutes the entire body. There's no portion of the body not affected by it. There's an old adage again, one is no better than his word. We know that. We have probably all experienced it at one time or another. You say something and that person doesn't follow through. He's no better than his word. That's the way the tongue is. The word course of nature comes from a phrase, ton trochion tes genesios. And there's two main words. The first of those, trochonon, from trochonos, which means wheel. And then the second, or the last of that the words in the phrase, but the second main word there, genesis. And genesis means the origin, birth, the source. And thus, this is dealing with the entirety of one's life. The illustration is that the wheel begins rolling at birth and continues till death. Some have come to this, the wheel of nature, the wheel of birth, or however one wants to translate this, and said, well, this refers to the doctrine of reincarnation. And they would express it as such. You have a wheel here, and you have spokes going out from the middle of that wheel. And each one of those spokes is a life. And when you get to the edge, then you're reincarnated and you have another spoke. And when you go through all of those series of reincarnations, you have the whole wheel, thus, of life. Well, the doctrine of reincarnation is a false doctrine. Very simply, easily, one passage destroys the entire theory of reincarnation. That passage would be Hebrews 9:27. It is appointed unto man once to die. After that, the judgment. Once to die, not many times. And so this has no reference to this false theory of reincarnation. Instead, you have the entirety of life is what he is expressing. This wheel begins to roll at birth and continues to death. The entirety of man's life. And the tongue, thus, he is setting forth, can influence man's entire life, man's entire existence. The tongue is going to affect us. Now, he then sets forth that the tongue is setteth on fire the course of nature and is set on fire of hell. the reason that the tongue can do so much evil is because its origin being from hell, when we use it in that improper way. Then that improper use of it originates in hell, and it will lead us there if we do not learn to control it. Hell is from the Greek word Gehenna. It is that place of eternal punishment. There is the Greek word Hades, which is oftentimes translated as hell by the King James translators, and I would say improperly translated. Hades deals with that unseen realm. But when we get to the Greek word Gehenna, it deals with that place of eternal punishment. It was originally referred to the valley of Hinnom, or Hinnom. This was a valley where refuse was kept burning, and it was kept burning to prevent pestilence and disease and such. It was a trash dump where this fire would be continually burning, and thus it became used in the sense of a place of burning, used by Jesus to denote an eternal place of burning, and thus hell. And hell thus would be more of an action that is taken by God against an evildoer. It's interesting. We many times hear those of the liberal persuasion talking about Jesus is love and God is a God of love. The word Gehenna is used 12 times in the New Testament, generally by our Lord. There's a lot of descriptions that are given to it elsewhere within the Scriptures, but Jesus is the one who uses the term so much. There is an Old Testament background comparing the valley of Hinnom, or fire, notice the aspect of fire, with judgment, condemnation, and punishment by God. And we're not going to read these passages, but study them yourself. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 22, Leviticus 10 verses 1 and 2, Isaiah 30 verses 27 through 33, Isaiah 66 verse 24, Daniel the 7th chapter and verse 10, the 18th Psalm in verse 8. There's that aspect of the valley of Hinnom, or fire, being used in relationship to condemnation or punishment by God. Now then, we come to Jesus, and he uses that aspect of Gehenna as thus a punishment by God. And we'll see Jesus using this term in Matthew the 5th chapter and verse 22, Matthew 5 and verse 29 and 30, Matthew 10 and verse 28, Matthew 18 and verse 9, Matthew 22 and verse 15 and verse 33, Mark the 9th chapter, verse 43 through verse 48, and Luke 12 and verse 5. Jesus uses this term in relationship to hellfire, an eternal place of punishment. But also notice some other descriptions of this, and again, we don't have time to go through all of these passages and deal with them, but these are descriptions of hell, even though they don't use the specific term hell. Such passages as Matthew 13, verse 42, Matthew the 25th chapter and verse 46, Philippians 3 and verse 19, 2 Thessalonians 1 verses 8 and verse 9, Hebrews the 10th chapter and verse 39, 2 Peter 2 and verse 9 and verse 17, Revelation 2 and verse 10, or verse 11, excuse me, Revelation 19 and verse 20, Revelation 20 verses 6, verse 10 and verse 14, and Revelation 21 and verse 8. All of these give us descriptions of hell, even though it does not use the term hell. And hell is thus a place of eternal torment and anguish, a place of pain, eternal darkness, outer darkness, and fire. All of these are descriptions of hell, along with others. Let me state in relationship to hell and the terms that are used to describe both hell and heaven. Generally speaking, I do not believe that those terms are literal terms. Instead, they are figurative terms to try to describe to man, in relationship to hell, the utter horror of hell that God picks out as far as man's associations, those things that are the most horrible things that could ever be thought of. And he says, that's what hell's like. And then he takes those things that are the most beautiful, the most wondrous things, and he uses those descriptions of heaven. Not that they are literal, but they are figurative to show the great beauty and the joy that heaven is, that is there in heaven. When we're dealing with hell, when we're dealing with heaven, it is hell, that place of just horror, and the place of heaven, place of great bliss. And so James here says that the tongue sets on fire the course of nature and is set on fire of hell, that with the improper use of the tongue, it originates in hell, and it's going to lead an individual to hell. That's the seriousness of the tongue. I think a lot of times we don't realize the seriousness of that. How many times do you hear individuals almost boastingly say, well, I say whatever pops in my mind. Well, shame on you. There's no excuse for it. You need to learn to control your tongue. Now then, verse 7. He makes a statement, for every kind of beast and of birds and of serpents and of things in the sea is tamed and hath been tamed of mankind. Here's a fourth illustration that he gives. Not every wild thing, he says, but every kind of creature has been tamed. There are some animals that you just cannot tame. You just control them where they cannot harm others. But all of these kinds of animals have been brought under the control and power of man. The word tamed is a Greek word demadzo, and it means subdued or restrained. It's curbed. The animals were given for man, and man was given the command, subdue the earth. Genesis 1, 27, 28, and Genesis 9, verses 1 and verse 2. So they are for the good of man. God created them. God didn't create this world for animals. He created it for man. And he put animals here for man's good. Some of these, as they're called, tree huggers and animal lovers, they almost think everything is for animals. Even man is for animals, and thus we should be subservient to them, but it's the other way around. We are to subdue the earth. Well, verse 8 then, he goes on, but the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. While animals and wild animals can be tamed, the tongue cannot be tamed. It's impossible for man to tame or to subdue his own tongue. Now, there's a continuous action with this word tame here. It is in that present tense, but it is also an aorist action. The tongue can no man, and the word can there is a present tense, or an aorist tense, while tame is a present tense. So there is that momentary action on a continuous basis. You cannot momentarily, all the time, restrain the tongue. It may be restrained for years, but in an unguarded moment, it leaps out and causes destruction. And Jerry, I understand that, and just go back and get what you might have missed, and we'll continue on. But there's that momentary action, aorist tense, might have controlled it for years and years, but there's that momentary action, unguarded moment, and bam, gets you, causes destruction. And thus there is the need to continue to control the tongue. It's an unruly evil. This word unruly literally means unrestrained. The Greek word akatasketos. American Standard uses restless, unruly, unrestrained, restless. And the allusion really is to a snake's tongue. You know how a snake's tongue darts out, moves back and forth real quick and comes back, and it's just always moving back and forth. That's the way that this is being described. It's an unruly evil, just always moving. And it's like a wild animal that's been caged. And if you've gone to the zoo sometimes and you've seen this wild animal in a cage and it's just walking, it's pacing back and forth, back and forth. Always, there's a continual restlessness in it. That's the way that the tongue is. And that's why we have to continue to control it. Let's notice first the 140th Psalm and verse 3. The psalmist says, "They have sharpened their tongues like a serpent. Adder's poison is under their lips." And in Romans, the 3rd chapter, and verses 13 and verse 14, "Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouths are full of cursing and bitterness." In both of these, there's that aspect of the snake. And like a snake that injects its poison by their teeth, the tongue, when used wrong, acts on the happiness, the peace of man, and the peace of society as poison does on humans. And that's the illustration that James is using here. The tongue is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. It acts to destroy, to kill the happiness or the joy, the blessedness that man has, and the peace of society. That's how poison acts on humans. It kills. The tongue can be used to kill. Verse 9, he says, "Therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men who are made after the similitude of God." He's asking the question, how can we bless God? Or we need to ask the question, maybe, how do we bless God? Can we bless God in the sense that we generally think of blessing, that God blesses us? What is it? He does something good for us. There is good that comes to us. Can we bless God in that way? Does He need anything from us? Well, we misunderstand the word bless as used here. It is the Greek word eulogeo, and we get our word eulogize from it. or eulogy. When we bury someone, we eulogize them. We speak well of them. It literally means good word. The EU of that, is good, and then the logio, which means word. So good word, and thus it is to speak well of. Thus, the tongue, when controlled, using it for good here, is capable of praising God, speaking well of God. And that's how it should be used. We need to learn to control our tongue so that we use it for speaking well of God. And this word speaking well of, bless, is in the present tense. Thus we keep on speaking well of God. On the other hand, though, he's showing the opposite and the inconsistent nature of this. He says we curse man. Curse comes from the Greek word kataraomai, and it means to speak evil of. And again, it's in the present tense, showing that this is an habitual practice. We continue to speak evil of man. This is the same tongue that is blessing God on the one hand, cursing man on the other hand. God would certainly be pleased with our blessing or speaking well of Him, but not pleased when we curse man. We should be continually praising God, speaking well of God with our tongue, and also speaking well of man who is like God. He uses the word who is after the similitude of God. This word similitude is from the Greek word homoiosis, and it means likeness. It's basically much like the Hebrew that's translated that God created man in His own likeness in Genesis 1, 26 and 27. We are in the likeness of God, the similitude of God. And thus James is showing in this term, we are made after the likeness of God. What? The greatness of the sin of cursing man. It's a great sin to curse man. Why? Because he's after the likeness of God. When we despise man thus, we are despising the handiwork of God, and thus God Himself. We need to be a loving people instead, and thus speaking well of them, and tie in for what John writes in 1 John 4, verses 20 and 21 in that way. But what we're seeing in this is that God and man are inseparable. We oftentimes, and I know that all of you have many times heard the aspect that Christ and His church are inseparable. And we see passages, for example, in Acts the 9th chapter, specifically verses 1 through 6, of Saul persecuting Christ, and yet he had been persecuting the church. Or Matthew the 25th chapter, on the scene of that judgment in verses 41 through verse 46, from a negative standpoint in particular, there, how that you do evil to man, or you fail to do good unto man, and you fail to do it to me, Christ says. Well, the separation, Christ and His church, you cannot make a separation there. In the way in which James is speaking here, nor can you separate God and man. And so he is showing the dignity of man, and that we are to hold man in respect, because he is made after the similitude, or after God's likeness. I think a lot of times we need some good lessons dealing with this, because we don't think of that in this way. We emphasize the aspect you don't mistreat the church, because when you do, you're mistreating Christ. But when you do that to man, who's made after the likeness of God, you're thus doing that to God Himself. Now then, if you extend this principle that James is using here, you're going to start seeing that the respect for man and the respect for life itself. And so, It's contrary, and God is contrary to murder, the unlawful taking of human life. We see the sin of abortion, because that is murder. It's nothing more than murder, but it's a lack of respect of life. See the same thing with euthanasia, or as euthanasia very simply means good death. And it means mercy killing. In other words, someone gets old, so we kill them. We murder them. Well, that's what it is, though. It's murder. It's a lack of respect for human life. Why should we respect human life? Because man's made after the likeness of God. Peter also teaches us we are to honor all men. 1 Peter 2 and verse 17. Why honor all men? Because they're made after the likeness of God. This also, another aspect, or from the opposite aspect of the cursing man, when we start realizing man's made after the likeness of God, and we start having a respect for life and for man, that becomes the basis for carrying the gospel to all men. Why should we take the gospel to that man in deep, dark Africa, let's say, or over in Russia, or in Africa, or some of these other places? Why carry the gospel to them? Well, of course, we generally say, well, Christ commanded it. He needs to be saved. Why? Because of a respect for man and for life. Why should we do good to all men? And this is where, again, the antis have fallen down in this area. They want to do good just to the church. Why should we do good to all men? Because of the respect for life. It's not so much, and it's not so much that man is worthy. He might not be in that sense, but God is. And that man is made after the likeness of God. And thus, you do good to them. You take the gospel to them. Why? Because he's made in the likeness of God, and God is worthy. And he's showing here, you need to control the tongue. Not curse man, because man's made after the likeness of God, after the similitude of God. And so, verse 10, out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. This action of blessing God and cursing man is sinful because he sets forth three things here. The first reason is because the mouth was created for holy purposes and not for base or sinful purposes. We are to use our mouth for good, for holy purposes, to praise God and praise man. Tie in with that Ephesians 4, verse 25, and Ephesians 4 and verse 29. Also Matthew 12 and verse 37. All of those passages and others like it. The tongue's created for holy purposes, so use it that way, not base or sinful ones. Second, this action is sinful because it is inconsistent to bless God and curse man. And that's why he's saying forth here. You can't bless God and curse man at the same time. Those are inconsistent. They're not. They're contradictory. And then third, what we see in verse 11 is that it's sinful because it's contrary to nature to utter such sentiments that are contradictory one to another. It's like saying I am and I am not. Contradictory to nature even. And to bless God and to curse man, that's contradictory to nature as well. Before we finish up this 10th verse, why don't we take our break at this point and start back after the break with these things ought not so to be.